Let's start to look at the female reproductive cycle. Non-pregnant females experience these cyclical changes in the ovaries and the uterus. So basically, we have an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle that are both taking place at the same time. The cycle involves oogenesis, which is the part that's happening inside the ovary to make the oocyte, and also the preparation of the uterus with that endometrial lining that thickens to receive the fertilized ovum. The ovarian cycle includes the changes that occur during and after the maturation of the oocyte. The uterine cycle involves the changes in the endometrium that prepare it for implantation. And all of this is going to start with gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So we're going to look at this cycle, the ovarian and the uterine cycle, in different steps, and then we're going to try to put it all together. In the first picture, we're going to look at days 1 through 5. And down here you can see the days, and you can see 1 through 5. You also see that this part right here is the layer of the endometrium and the thickness of it. And what you notice is that as we go from day 1 to 2 to 3, 4, and 5, that thickness decreases. And the reason why this decreases is because of menstrual flow. In other words, menses, menstruation, the bleeding that takes place is from the endometrial lining that starts to slough off and basically is going to get replaced later on in this uterine cycle. So this part down here is the uterine cycle because, of course, we are looking at the uterus. Simultaneously, what's happening in the ovaries is that starting with the hypothalamus and the gonadotropin releasing hormone, what we get are FSH and LH that go to the oocytes. And these primary follicles will start to develop into secondary follicles. And you can see that they're getting larger. You can see that corona radiata. You can see that antrum is just starting to form right there from these hormones. Now, if we look at the ovarian hormone levels at this point, they're kind of flat. You can see that estrogen is starting to go up just a little bit. And this is in a response to that LH that is going to the ovary. The cells that are around these follicles are going to be the ones that make that estrogen. So they'll start responding to it by making that estrogen. The follicle stimulating hormone is causing these cells to proliferate. And so estrogen levels should continue to rise with this trend. However, notice that progesterone is pretty flat and doesn't seem to change at this point just yet. Next, we're going to look at days 6 through 12. And for days 6 through 12, what we see, and this is after we saw that we had that menstrual flow, the endometrial lining begins to get thicker. So you can see that day 6, for example, is here, but then the endometrium starts to thicken, and that is what's happening in the uterine cycle. If we look at the ovarian cycle, what we see is that these secondary follicles are going to be developing more and more and are going to start getting larger. And what we see is that this antrum begins to develop. Now, this estrogen that comes out of these follicles with inhibin is going to go back with this dotted line and cause negative feedback on the anterior pituitary and on the hypothalamus. And that's why you see these lower levels of FSH, for example, is because these hormones are being inhibited by those high estrogen levels, which you can see right here that the estrogen levels are significantly rising. Now, at this point, progesterone is still flat, and we're going to see that progesterone will take over in the future. So the next part is going to be days 13 through 14. And here what we're going to see is that, again, the endometrium is still thickening. And you can see right here that we are going to get this endometrium to get thicker and thicker. In the uterine cycle, we're going to see that estrogen levels go really, really high right there, right before day 13. And this increase in estrogen above threshold ends up stimulating the hypothalamus in a way that is unexpected. Typically, if there is estrogen, the hypothalamus will be inhibited, but in this case, the opposite happens. The hypothalamus and anterior pituitary are actually going to get stimulated by this high estrogen. And this is going to cause the LH surge, which is also being shadowed by the FSH levels going up as well. If we look at these levels right here, we see that LH shoots up, and right under it is the FSH. Now, it has been shown that it is the LH surge that induces ovulation. And so even though the FSH is there, it's almost there as one that's following the LH, but not the primary cause of ovulation. And so this ovulation is going to take place, and what's going to happen is that the antrum that's filled with fluid is going to put so much pressure on that oocyte that that oocyte will get ejected out into the fallopian tube. Now, the egg is ejected and is inside the fallopian tube, but if you remember, the cells that are surrounding it, the ones that had the antrum inside of it, that turns into the corpus hemorrhagicum, which eventually also turns into this endocrine organ called the corpus luteum. Now, we call it an endocrine type organ because this corpus luteum starts to secrete a very large amount of progesterone. And so what you see is basically the progesterone becomes the most important hormone at this point. You can see that, in fact, it overtakes estrogen in amount, that progesterone becomes the one that's in higher levels. And what progesterone does is it causes the uterine endometrium to thicken significantly during this time because, of course, now that ovulation has taken place, if there are sperm, then that means that fertilization can take place, and that means that we can get a zygote and we can get a blastocyst, and then we're going to be looking for implantation to take place. And so you can see that the uterine endometrium really, really thickens during that time. Now, it is very important to note that at this point, and you can see that the progesterone levels are going down right here, this assumes that there is no implantation and therefore no pregnancy. And if there is no implantation and no pregnancy, the corpus luteum turns into a corpus albicans and stops making progesterone. As progesterone levels drop, that means that this endometrium will start sloughing off and you end up getting menstruation. However, let's assume that pregnancy does take place. If pregnancy does take place, then these progesterone levels, instead of dropping, will actually keep on going up throughout and will stay very, very elevated throughout the pregnancy. And that corpus luteum will stick around for about 6 months and keep on making progesterone. And then after that point, the placenta will take over as the as the organ that makes most of the progesterone to keep the pregnancy going. So this picture is all those days that we kind of chopped up and we looked at individually, all on one graph, and it shows you that there are about 28 days on average per cycle. Again, this is an average. It tells you that these primary oocytes at the beginning of the ovarian cycle will basically mature into these Graafian follicles or mature follicles, that ovulation will take place. This corpus hemorrhagicum will turn into the corpus luteum, and if there's no pregnancy, that corpus luteum will turn into the corpus albicans. Simultaneously, it shows you that the FSH and LH levels are, for the most part, being inhibited by estrogen. But when estrogen levels go way up, what you get is this LH surge right in the middle on day 14. And that's going to be where ovulation typically takes place, is right there on day 14. The hormones from the ovaries, it shows you that estrogen is the hormone that is in higher quantities at first and is going to go up until it hits about day 13. And then you get that LH surge, and then it starts basically dropping down. And then it also shows you that the corpus luteum, which only starts to be around after day 14, will end up giving us that rise in progesterone that basically gives us that thick endometrium. And just remember that right here, that progesterone has to stay elevated if pregnancy is going to continue. But if pregnancy does not take place, we get that corpus albicans, so progesterone levels drop, and then we end up getting menstruation and the cycle resumes. And then here we see the menstrual flow, and we see that typically days 1 through 5 have that menstrual flow, followed by a thickening of the endometrium. And then what we see is on day 14, once ovulation takes place, that corpus luteum makes a lot of progesterone. Then that's the hormone that is able to bring that endometrial lining to a very, very large thickness, which allows for implantation. If there is no fertilized ovum that tries to implant, what's going to happen is we lose that corpus luteum. It turns into the corpus albicans. That means we don't have the progesterone that can keep this endometrial lining thick, which means we end up getting menstrual flow again at the end of this, and we start this all over again.